Yesterday on my stream, I had watched these two videos here because conservatives have been absolutely losing their mind. It's called "The Problem with White People," and then taking responsibility for systemic racism. And I've seen a lot of content creators complain about this, like Ben Shapiro, The Quartering, and of course, I'm a really big Jon Stewart fan. So I'm like, these guys are being ridiculous. And I actually did a reaction to Ben Shapiro. I put it on my alt channel, the Papa Got Leftovers. And there didn't seem to be a whole lot of points being made other than like, oh, I'm uncomfortable. But I decided to watch it yesterday still because I was like, oh, maybe there's something that we could learn from this. And I did, and I have to say, I'm truly disappointed. I have a full reaction that I'm trying to put up on my YouTube, but it got DMCA'd for a small clip. But I feel it's necessary for context, and I think I'll be able to push through the strike. But it might take a while. So I figured, hey, let me just do a rundown, like a little recap, and what really bothered me about these videos. Okay. So the first video here, for the most part, I agreed with. It really is just introducing like the concept of systemic racism, or more than that. It does a really good job of showing the media hypocrisy. It doesn't just call out what you would consider like your more conservative racism, I guess. It criticizes like your Nancy Pelosi's for being very performative or being very performative. He talks about or briefly goes into the rebranding of things like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's rice as if that's going to actually help black people. And I thought it was a really good video. It was a bit uncomfortable. The ending was a little showy right here. And of course the title, "The Problem with White People," is uncomfortable, and it's a little clickbaity. And it could I can understand why the messaging may have hurt the message in this case, right? For those of you who don't like messaging or message, the message is what you're trying to say. The messaging is really how you say it. But for the most part, I was like, yeah, this video's solid. I liked it a lot. It wasn't until this video here that I became the most disappointed I've ever been in Jon Stewart, unironically. It was horrible. The and you can see this scene here. This guy. Okay, let me just explain to you. It's so frustrating. We have to understand that Jon Stewart creates the show. Obviously, what it means is he controls all the variables. And this, to me, is a level of hypocrisy because he called in two white. Well, first of all, this is a conversation about systemic racism, and he decided to just have a bunch of white people here. To me, that really bothered me. It rubbed me the wrong way. You'd think that if you're trying to talk about like black issues, you'd bring a black person on since you have the resources. But I kind of forgave that because he's like, oh, it's time for white people to talk. I was like, okay, whatever. But then, like I said, he controls the variables, and you have two white people here that he agrees with, and then one that he disagrees with. He creates that. And this guy doesn't do a particularly good job at expressing the general frustrations and concerns of the average American. And it was really bothersome because this really came off as a performance piece. This felt like Jon Stewart brought this guy on so that they could just constantly ridicule him and generate audience laughter. This wasn't a productive conversation, and it felt like an incredible virtue signal, right? And every time this guy tried to make a point, like for instance, he made a point about how like black families weren't doing particularly, like they don't have a strong family unit anymore. And of course, there are people who say that to dismiss black issues, but not once did he press the guy on like what he meant. This guy also supported better funding for schools in like poor areas, better wealth redistribution in some capacity. We never got to flesh it out because Jon Stewart just used him as a look at the bad guy. And so we didn't get anywhere with it. And the reason that this is a problem is because, okay, actually, the biggest reason this is a problem, and one of the things that really bothered me too, is that Jon Stewart said that he's tired of having to have these conversations. It's really frustrating because these are the conversations that need to be had. And I know that black people are tired of having to have the conversation of educating people on their own oppression. And that makes sense. But as a white person, you just don't get to say that. The whole point of being a white activist is, or somebody who talks about white issue or black issues through like a white lens, is to educate other white people who just don't get it. Right? Black people, people who are willing to listen to the black people in their experience, they absorb information and then they will usually clash that information with their upbringing and experience, and then they'll either come out of the other side disagreeing or agreeing. people who agree, like Jon Stewart and myself, it's then your responsibility to say, like, hey, here are some different ways for you to understand why this is a thing, because you may not understand it. That's your whole fucking job. That's it. That's literally all you're supposed to do. And Jon Stewart failed emphatically. The frustration he brought felt incredibly performative. He would get riled up. He would stoke the audience. The audience would then laugh at this guy. It was unproductive. And there was nothing of value here. It felt like an incredible virtue signal. You could see he brought up the fact that he was an immigrant and he came here, and he felt like one of the moments that really frustrated this guy is that they kept labeling America as like a white supremacist country, a country that is still riddled with white supremacy. And I understand why people would say that, but I disagree. We're a country that still has racism within it, especially we are massively negatively impacted by historical systemic racism, and it needs to be changed. But saying that we're still a white supremacist country, it just doesn't land with the majority of people in America. And you might say that, well, that's the white perspective. I don't care, because we're explaining it to white people. Like, if you want to be so hell bent on saying everything is white supremacy over actually getting the message across of implementing real change. I don't think everything is white supremacy. There's still racism in the system. I think it's mostly echoes of the past, systemic racism. It's still very powerful and very bad. But a lot of people, like average American, gets very offended when you say that the entire country is still racist and rooted in white supremacy, because they just don't. It's just not. There's still issues, and a lot of it has to do with wealth redistribution. I mean, that's a huge factor there. And there's more complex issues than that, of course. But you have a bunch of white people sitting down talking about it. So, like, what black experience can you really get from, as far as the specifics? And they also, especially her, she defined racism as like on a spectrum. And I know some people will identify that, right? The way that she identified racism was like, hey, listen, this is racism. It's on a spectrum. And basically what she's trying to say is everything from like your KKKs, which would be down here. This is where your KKK is, to all the way on the other side. But this is like, I don't know, I guess slightly tightening up when you see a black person. All that is racist. Right? The bare minimum, like, or you know what, not even that, from like the KKK to like not understanding black issues. I would say racial ignorance. It's all on a spectrum of like racism. I can't really draw. And the problem that you're going to have with that for the majority of people in a communication perspective is if you tell them that any way that they interact with black people is racist, they're not going to care anymore. They're just going to be racist. They're just going to be, okay, I don't care anymore. They're going to tune out. If you put it on the spectrum more of like, hey, listen, this is like, here's the KKK, this is racist, and like, here's calling someone the N-word, or something like that. This is like racism here, and this is like ignorance. And ignorance doesn't mean stupidity. Ignorance is just a lack of understanding. It's really not like a huge thing. The messaging here is better. What I found really funny though is that when they compounded all racial, like racism and ignorance together, it's clear that they are all racist. Because there is a profound amount of ignorance here in their messaging. They're not doing anything positive. Nobody that didn't understand black issues watched this and said, I get it now. There was no depth. When for instance, he brought up the black family, and he said the black family unit is like, it needs to be strengthened. Now, if you look at the data, the better that a family, if somebody has both their mother and father in their life, they perform better. It's just an objective. I didn't have a father and I'm doing just fine. Jon Stewart too. But when you look at the data, generally speaking, people with both parents do better. Now, this can be a ignorant talking point from white people to just say like, oh, it's all black people's fault and it's their responsibility. However, it can also be, and we never had to press him on this, an understanding that honestly, our current welfare system has ruined the black community. There's a direct correlation with the dismantling of the black family and welfare. Not because black people can't handle being on welfare. It's because black people are disproportionately poor and on welfare at a greater rate than white people. The same issues happen in white areas as well. The difference is you don't really have what you'd call like historical oppression in poor white areas, where you have that in poor black areas. It is a complicated conversation. But so what is the outcome here? Well, we need to reform our welfare system very clearly, but nobody wants to talk about it. It's one of those things where we're so fucking ignorant, especially progressives, where we think that everything that we've ever done has been a net 100% positive. And I would say that the expansion of welfare is a net positive, but it's to such a degree where we can't say like, okay, what that makes sense. Well, what it's like, what are the issues with the welfare system? Well, the welfare tends to advocate unintentionally for the conditions that made people go on welfare in the first place, right? So let's say you have trouble getting a job, and this issue manifests itself more in poor areas where there's no other opportunity. But let's say you're like you can't really get a job, and you go on welfare, and you get like let's say $10,000 a year. And you live in a really poor community, and you might be able to get a job that pays you $11,000 or $12,000 a year, working 40 hours a week. What are you going to choose? You're probably going to stay on welfare, especially since that's like the best job you'll ever get. There's really there's not a high chance that you'll get another job, and on top of that, because there's not a lot of jobs in the area, and there's not a lot of growth. But on top of that, if you lose your job, it's really difficult to get onto welfare. And so, what do? You say, well, I think I'll just stay on welfare. It's the safe play. I would do it too. Most of us would do it. You might lie to yourself, but most of us would do it. So clearly the glaring issue with welfare is how difficult it is to get on and off of it, how it's not the safety net that it needs to be. And this is the reason why I'm for like a universal basic income. I've been leaning more towards a negative income tax. And all that means is that the less money you make, the more money you'll get back from the government. So like, let's say you make less than, this is just a for instance, right? You make less than like $10,000 a year. Let's say you make $0 a year. The government gives you like 10 grand a year. Let's say you make $5 grand a year. The government gives you 9 grand a year. Let's say you make 10 grand a year. The government gives you 8 grand a year. And it's like on a sliding scale. And you might say, I don't like that idea because I don't think giving people free money is helping. But what is welfare doing? It's giving people free money. The only difference is that it's so heavily conditional, it's simply not working. And when you look at every successful country, every westernized country, which is doing very well and has very high quality of life, all of them have a form of a welfare system. And it works well. This is just simpler. Rather than saying, here's money for rent and food and this and that, it's just like, here's money and do what you want with it. And it makes more sense, and it's easier to slide on and off of it. So like, oh, you lose your job, well, you just go back down to that bracket where you get more money again. It's not like a super complex thing. And it puts money into communities for people. Now, a lot of people would say like, hey, listen, Papa God, what if they did the wrong thing with the money? And I would say a couple things. One, what does that mean? Doing the wrong thing with your money depends on how much money you make, right? Like if I went out and bought a $1,000 TV today, I already have a TV. Who cares, right? Because I have plenty of money. But if somebody that's poor goes out and buys a TV, that would be the wrong thing. And I understand you have to live within your means, but we should also understand that like doing the wrong thing is usually overspending in some capacity, which is something that needs to be regulated. But when you have a reasonable stream of income through like a negative income tax, bad decisions are less likely to ruin your life, right? If you make a bad investment and you have the ability and you know that you can recover from that bad investment, you're more likely to be better with your money in the future. Whereas a lot of people, and I've been here before, where you do your best to save money. And a lot of times you're working your ass off. You're working like 40, 50, 60 hours a week and you save $50 a week. You know, like you barely save any money. If that, that's a lot. And then let's say you save up like, oh, I saved up $300. I'm so happy. What happens? Your car breaks down and you spent $500 in the car. And now you're like, wow, I'm negative $200. And when that continuously happens, people tend to not care about their credit. They don't care about their spending. They just go like, nothing matters anyway. So I'm going to be, who cares? If you have the ability to recover from those decisions, you tend to make less bad decisions. Additionally, some people will spend it incorrectly. Some people will buy drugs with it, and it's unfortunate, but it's just the reality. And you should be more focused on getting people deterring people from doing drugs in the first place, rather than getting people off of drugs. I know that sounds so horrible and harsh, but it's really difficult to get people to reform and get off of drugs. It's one of those things where once you're on, it's very difficult to get off. And we should obviously have systems to help those people. But the reality is it's easier to prevent somebody from going on to drugs. Because why do people go on drugs? Usually, it can be like an overprescription of like a medication that causes a dependency. It can be self-medicating to cope. There's a lot of different factors, but you can reduce those factors if you give people money, which then also allows them to utilize that money on welfare. So these are the types of things that we didn't get into a nuanced conversation. This guy even talked about how he thinks we need better education systems in like Black communities. Like he's like, yeah, we need more community investment. It's like, wow, like this guy, from the bare minimum that we got to hear, he's somebody who's more moderately progressive that believes in wealth redistribution in some capacity. But Jon Stewart just never really let him talk, and they just used him as a jump off point to yell at him, say that they're tired of white people. And to have the audience laugh and ridicule this guy. And Jon Stewart historically went on Crossfire, and he called out, fucking Tucker Carlson for having, and whoever else the guy was, I forget his name, for having performative conversations that don't do anything. And this is a performative conversation that didn't do anything positive. I've had, especially early, when I was really more into like politics on the stream, I would have a lot of people come in and they would have a lot of conversations about universal basic income. And a lot of conservative people. And I tell you that almost every single one of them that came in was not sold on the idea of UBI, but was open to the idea of a universal basic income. They were open to the idea and the concept of systemic racism. That's the point of being a white person that talks about black issues, is to because you understand white people better than black people, right? That's the whole point. You amplify the message of black Americans that are frustrated with their conditions in a way that's palatable for white people. That's your whole point. That's the only reason you exist. Because if everybody would just fucking listen, we wouldn't be here. And yet Jon Stewart failed emphatically. This guy was a good representation of your average American, and he just failed on the messaging. And if you're in a situation where you're trying to educate people on issues, you can't speak to your audience. It's not for your audience. It's for the people who don't get it. And so I am really disappointed because I love Jon Stewart. But the reality is just like the title in here suggests, Jon Stewart truly is the problem with white people. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and another special shout out to all my Patreon and Twitch subs. If you'd like to support this channel further than you already have by just watching the video alone, go down to the links below where you can sub on my Patreon, which will allow you to get your name on this beautiful black wall. Or you can go to the Twitch page and you can actually use a free Amazon Prime sub, if you have Amazon Prime, to subscribe. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.